Technology, digital technology and geopolitics, geotechnology in short, are now closely interrelated, with the danger at the same time of confrontation and of fragmentation of the world. The importance of digital technologies, digitalization and connectivity, have grown with the pandemic, as it has allowed relations between citizens and the continuation of a large part of the economic life and the lockdowns. The geopolitical importance of digital technology, now closely linked with biotechnology, grew before the pandemic. The competition between the United States and China in this crucial field started early. It has become clear that technological dominance is an essential prerequisite of power in our world, including in the military realm. The arrival of China in the upper echelons of fields such as artificial intelligence, AI, and biotechnology, for so long dominated by the US, has provoked a certain alarm in the West. Let me remind that Russian President Vladimir Putin stated already in 2017 that the nation that leads in AI will be the ruler of the world. What is called the new Cold War, or Cold War 2.0, in the making between the US and China, has a clear digital technology component. Digital technology in general, in this competition, is important in several dimensions. First, the economic one, obvious. In this, the US has understood that the crucial element is access to the most advanced semiconductors and other technology, and that is why it is excluding China from them. Secondly, it has also to do with the race in the field of regulation and standard setting, as some of my colleagues more knowledgeable will explain. Werner von Siemens, the 19th century German industrialist who founded the company that bears his name, said, "He who owns the standards owns the market. Regulation is power, and standard setting is becoming the new geopolitical battleground." Both are essential in this competition with China and for transatlantic relations. A new wave of regulation is in the making for the digital economy, from content to data and anti-monopolist moves. I just wanted to point in this respect that today it could be said that something like the ETU, the International Telecommunication Union, a specialized agency of the UN, has become as important as the Security Council as it deals with machine learning, healthcare, standards, and AI. China is increasingly active in those kinds of institutions. Third, the security and military dimension. Now, with the question of the dual use, civil and security military, that has always been there, but has grown in importance with the military, not always at the forefront of innovation compared to the past. But the tech revolution is transforming military affairs. This includes cybersecurity and cyber manipulation. The fourth, the social one, not only to fill different gaps within and among countries and regions, but also because I think digitalization and connectivity have become or should be treated as public services and common goods, even if they are most often served by private companies. Next year, Italian presidency of the G20 wants this forum to approve a guarantee of universal internet access. And fifth, the political one. Digital technology has become part of our political system, of our political regimes, to connect governments and citizens, also to shape opinion, but also to control citizens, as in the case of authoritarian regimes in some countries. In this sense, we could talk about not dual use, but triple hybrid use, civil, security, and political, with big tech being political and geopolitical players. All this could lead to a decoupled world in technological terms, including internet, that has so far managed to maintain a unitary approach, even if balkanized by national firewalls and control, but is essentially unregulated. Europe is between the idea of a surveillance state, China, and surveillance capitalism, the US. With the defense of its own values like privacy and regulation, it is important for Europe the search for strategic autonomy. The United States, Europe, and China have realized technology is neither culturally neutral nor devoid of values. It showcased deep cultural differences between systems. Thus, technology ushers a class of cultures to which insufficient attention has been paid. We tend to focus on the US, China, and Europe, but the rest of the world is also important. What could this decoupling mean for the rest of the world, for regions of great interest in Europe, as Africa and Latin America, plus the rest of China, of Asia, including China, no? Will they have to choose? No, if the main concept in this respect is not uniformity, but interoperability. I end with one consideration. The governance of all this cannot be just in the hands of governments. There are other players. We need a multi-stakeholder approach that we have been proposing in the G20 context. Thank you. Raquel, you have the floor, or rather the screen.
Hi, thank you, Andres. So first of all, I will very much appreciate the chance to thank Internet Governance Forums Spain's team for the organization of such an important event, especially its adaptation to these different times. So as Andres Ortega said, technologies have always been present with us. However, the 21st century has opened up a new pathway in which traditional, new, and emerging technologies play an active role in our lives and spread across all layers of our society, so individually, as a community, and also at the multilateral level. So technologies are no longer only a driver of economic growth and interconnectivity, but also a geopolitical asset. It has become an element of competition and sometimes confrontation. And that is why we are here today, and I have to say that I couldn't think of a better panel of experts to talk about it. So today we will talk about artificial intelligence, 5G technologies, Internet of Things, cybersecurity, even blockchain if it comes up, or the very data governance models that are being used and deployed. So I would like to first introduce Manuel Muñiz Villa. Manuel Muñiz Villa is the Secretary of State for Global Spain. He was also director of the Center for Governance of Change at IE, fellow at the Harvard Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and he holds a PhD in International Relations from Oxford University. So considering this geopolitical scenario in which we are coming up with the growth of a divided internet, the development of international cyber norms, surveillance and censorship methods, how may we define, the Secretary of State, the current scenario of geopolitics of technologies and communications? Can we talk about confrontation or rather about competition, or both? And which are the main opportunities and challenges that we may find in this geotechnology scenario? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me fine, Raquel? Yeah. So it's wonderful to be with you all, and thank you for the organizers for inviting me and giving me the chance to talk about this. I'm going to be fairly brief so that we can also have a conversation with the rest of the panelists and maybe address some questions at the end. The topic is massive, and it's hard to grasp unless you bring some structure to it. So I'm going to try to bring some structure to it. And I want to hang everything from something Andres said, which was strategic autonomy of Europe, because I think that the concept of strategic autonomy, this is my bet, and you can hold me to this if we meet again in a year's time, will be essential to understanding Europe's foreign policy and Europe's policy writ large, because it's going to affect a large number of fields. I think it's going to affect the way we construct our common foreign and security policy in the near future. So when we speak of strategic autonomy, in fact, historically, when we spoke of that, we usually meant foreign policy. But it's also going to spill over into the trade and commerce area, because there's a large debate going on right now about how we build resilience into our supply chains so that we don't have the supply issues that we had at the beginning of the crisis in the months of March and April. We had supply challenges when it came to medicines and protective equipment and things of the like at the beginning of the crisis. So, but there's a third dimension, which is the one I'm going to focus entirely on, which is the digital space, and some people have termed this digital sovereignty. But in my mind, I think it's one big dimension of strategic autonomy. And honestly, because of its scale, I think it's only going to be something that we can address at a European level. So even though we're thinking about this from Spain, and there are pieces of the puzzle that can be built by the member states, I think at the end it's so big that it'll be European. And now within this concept of of digital sovereignty, I think there are three big components. One has to do with power and with the geopolitics of technology squarely. And I think the issue here is if you look at the distribution of key technologies that are central to our security and our capacity to exercise power, most of them are in fact not developed in Europe, or European providers are not competitive. So, the most competitive 5G providers are non-European, although we have some European providers that are getting better and better. The most competitive cloud providers are not European. The geolocation services that are most competitive still, until we have Galileo up and running, are non-European. The operating software and systems of cell phones and mobile networks are non-European. So when you look at all of these things in the aggregate, I think it poses a big challenge for Europe when it comes to our capacity to act internationally. And I think we're coming to grips with the fact that these technologies, particularly digital technologies and telecommunications technology, but not only, I think cloud computing and processing capacity are becoming also very central in this debate. But if you take them at the aggregate, basically they're fundamental to our national security, and we're starting to understand that this is the case, right? So when I think about this, the first bucket of things has to do with the new geopolitics of technology. The second bucket of things is linked to rights and freedoms. And this, it looks, it seems like a footnote, but this is very, very central. And within this area of rights and freedoms in the digital economy, I think there are three issues that are worth mentioning. Probably there are many more, but I think three are very important. One is the right to information, to valid and truthful information. And I think, deliberative democracies are built on our capacity to conduct an open and truthful debate. And I think the new landscape of digital technology, particularly social media platforms and their effect on how news are generated and distributed, has a big impact on our capacity to sustain a healthy public debate. And here there are two phenomena that converge in time, and it's unfortunate that they in fact converge. One is that we've had the rise of these social media networks and platforms that claim to be exclusively platforms, so they're not liable for the content they distribute. So they're literally irresponsible actors in the public debate space. And they defend this tooth and nail, because were they to be considered media platforms or media companies, they would have to have fact checkers and editors, and they would be liable for the content they distribute. So we have this growing space of articulators of our public debate, that very much like the public debate space before the libel laws and others, is a bit like the Far West, right? It's a space where you can distribute these falsehoods, and there are very little consequences for the platforms that enable that. Now, in parallel to this, and this is what I meant before by saying this is particularly unfortunate, many of these platforms have a business model that is built on sources of income that were the key sources of income of our traditional articulators of the public debate. So these are, the normal media companies, journals and newspapers and TV and radio companies. So at the same time, you have this huge erosion of the business model of the traditional media companies. So overall, this is producing, I think, a growing fragility in our public debate. It is much more exposed to falsehoods, and it's becoming harder and harder to arrive at collective and truths. And these are fundamental in a deliberative democracy if we are to be able to move forward. So I think that this rights issue, particularly the right to information, is essential. But there are other two things in this rights sort of bucket. One has to do with privacy, and it was mentioned before that it is around privacy that we should build the entire architecture of the protection of people's very fundamental rights not to be monitored, not to be surveilled, not to be repressed for your opinions, So this is, and this for Europe and for Spain is very important. But it goes even further, and this is my third point, which has to do with the right to free agency. And I think that this is normally underplayed in our debate about emerging technologies. But given the convergence of big data and AI on our knowledge of neuroscience and behavioral sciences, the frontier, the border between knowing how people behave, monitoring how they behave, and our capacity to manipulate how they behave is becoming thinner and thinner. That border is becoming thinner. So you can either have corporations have this information and use it for their own purposes, fundamentally to nudge people into particular types of behavior, or you can have the state have this information and have the state be able to manipulate people's political and public activities. In either case, in both cases, what you're having is a clear impingement on people's free agency. Now, and this connects back to the privacy piece. In Europe, we think that in fact data should be owned by the people that produce the data. It's not a byproduct of people's activities. It's in fact an asset that they're producing, and it's something that should be of their property. And the reason why this is important, and I'll get into the economics in a minute, is precisely because it's through that legal construction around the rights of the ownership of data that we can protect also free agency and free will. So, not to exaggerate the consequence of this, but I think that there's a very slippery slope if we enable either large corporations or governments to accumulate all this data and exploit it for their own gains. And I think that the way to limit that is by empowering people to possess, control, and be aware of the use of their data on a day-to-day basis. Now, the third bucket, and I'll finish on this, is the economics of digital. And when we're speaking about digital sovereignty or we're speaking about strategic autonomy, surely the economics of this have to come into play. And as I was saying before, I think we still have a way to go in Europe if we want to be competitive on key sectors. So I was looking at the latest data, and out of the 100 most successful AI startups in the past couple of years, about 4, this is a report by McKinsey, 4 were European. So this is in the AI space. I mean, this means 96 were not, right? So, and most of those 96 were either Chinese or American. And this is perhaps in the most important field of innovation right now, when it comes to its impact on the economy and productive processes. Just to give you an example, AI, out of the largest 20 internet companies in the world, not a single one is European, right? So we have this challenge of occupying the frontier of the economy. Why is this important? Well, this is important because we now know that it's these frontier companies that implement technology very quickly, that are capable of attracting human capital and others. They're the ones that are growing in productivity and in competitiveness very markedly. So the OECD, in fact, calls them frontier firms. It's about 5% of all firms in advanced economies, and it refers to the rest as laggard companies because their productivity growth is stalling. We know these companies concentrate the highest paying jobs. We know that they concentrate the highest revenue. So also, our fiscal traction is very much dependent on having these companies, within our territories and having activity within our territories. So, we have a real economic strategic interest in being at the frontier of this economy. If we don't want to lose this entire wave of economic development, I think if we lose this wave structurally, sort of systematically, it would equate to arriving late to the Industrial Revolution, and I think there'll be a sort of a generational cost to not doing this. Now, how do we fix this? I'm sure we can get into this in the discussion, but if I had to point to 2 very important things that Europe should do, is I think we should perfect our transfer mechanisms, the relationship between our research, academic, venture capital, startup, and corporation ecosystems. I think we have a way to go there to be as competitive as some of these places are in the US and China, in Shenzhen, or in Silicon Valley, or in Boston, or in other places that have these very effective and well-tailored transfer mechanisms. Another area where I think we can do a lot is on the completion of the European digital single market, because scalability is perhaps, together with the transfer piece and the applied research piece, is the biggest bottleneck that we have to basically to the success of our startups and to the scalability of our most competitive companies in Europe. So there, at least on those two fronts, and maybe if I had to add a third, it would be the work being done in Europe, in Brussels, by the VP of the Commission, Vestager, on industrial policy for the digital era. So she's really looking at how do we use the recovery fund and others and the multi-year financial framework, the budget of the EU, to strengthen key sectors in key clusters and hubs and position Europe strategically in some of these, whether it's banking, finance, agri, and food, or bio, or mobility and smart cities. So there are a number of these very important projects that are now sort of trickling down to national budgets and others. No, but I think we have a very important agenda there on the economics of digital. So if you take it all together, and I'll finish with this phrase, we have a challenge ahead of us, but it's a good challenge to have. There's nothing structural in Europe that should prevent us from being extremely competitive in this space. We have arguably some of the best infrastructure in the world, both physical and digital infrastructure. We have some of the best human capital in the world. We have some of the best research and academic ecosystems in the world. So there's nothing in the mix of ingredients in Europe that would prevent us from taking the lead on some of these fields. So I'll leave it at that, but I think the debate can be more relevant. It touches on everything. It touches on power and geopolitics. It touches on rights and the health of our democracies, and it touches on the economics and the future of our economic model. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State for Global Spain. So, as Manuel Muñiz was saying, one of the main starting points to define how the geopolitics of technology and communications is being shaped is through data governance and data standardization. So, in this regard, I would like to give the floor to Tim Rulik, who is a research fellow at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, where he is working on EU-China relations as well as Chinese foreign policy. So, Tim, with regard to data standardization, how could you say that this is the starting point to define how the rest of technologies are shaping the geopolitics of our current times?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me well. If not, you just interrupt. Well, thanks so much. I'm very impressed by Mr. Muniz's introductory speech, or his first intervention in this panel. I won't even try to get as comprehensive, but focus on one very specific field in the few minutes I have, and that is technical standardization. Let me give you 1 minute sort of context, so you understand sort of how I come to think about this and how I think we should debate technical standards. I think what we see is sort of a geopolitical, geoeconomic turn in international affairs most broadly. Mr. Muniz has already sort of referenced this is not just happening in the digital space, but obviously the digital space is extremely important. And I think if you just recall earlier this week that Sweden has decided to ban 2 Chinese technology companies, Huawei and ZTE, on grounds of national security from the rollout of the next generation of its 5G infrastructure here in Sweden, 5G. So then you can actually, I think, see that that there is a dimension to the geoeconomics of technology that we haven't thought of before. And I think this is just one example that shows us very well that we are living in a changing time here. And technical standardization is an aspect that we tend to not think about in those terms, that we still still not in the focus of the public debate on those questions, but it is very much included in that. And I think to start with on technical standards here, I think it's an excellent example of how we need to sort of shift our perception of what's happening and also to discuss how to react. One aspect that we need to bear in mind is where do we come from? Technical standards are essentially product specifications. What they help us to do is to spread technology, technological solutions, and products that are based on those technological solutions. What is a technical standard? For example, USB. We are all familiar with USB because it allows us to connect a multitude of devices to our computers, to chargers, etc. But USB is actually a global standard, and this is why across countries and across manufacturers we can use a USB. Well, we have a long thought of technical standards to be non-political, and I think if you just consider USB, this is very logic. I mean, there's just a couple of producers, of vendors who need to sort of come to terms what kind of technology to use as a global standard so we can all profit from it, and that new products can sort of be developed based on this technical standard. And already a couple of years ago, this sort of very idealized perception that this is just a technical search for the best solution has been questioned, and it has been pointed out that this is essentially competition among companies. But what is new is sort of that actually also states see a value in trying to press through technical standards. The question is how and why do they do that? And I think the main aspect here is that technical standards can enhance the power of states. And here, this might have been a potential that has long been there, but I think it's very much coming to the fore. It's very much coming to the minds of people around the world, to state leaders around the world, and they're trying to utilize this. And I think China is particularly strategic about it. And it is particularly successful in it. Europe traditionally is too, but China is catching up very quickly, and I'm coming to that in a minute. How is technical standardization important for power? I think there's 4 dimensions that we have to differentiate here. There's an economic dimension, there's a legal dimension, there's a political dimension, a discursive dimension. Economically, many technical standards, particularly in ICT, are actually are patented technology that come with the distribution of patent of royalty rights that other companies need to pay in order to get access to those standard essential patents, as they're called. And they have adaptation and switching costs. Just to give you an impression, a company like Ericsson makes around 20% of its revenue with the licensing of its technology. So patenting is extremely important for the competitiveness of our industry. And Mr. Muniz has already explained, I think, very well how the competitiveness is also important to us politically. Legally, technical standards are on paper voluntary. They are private self-regulation. They're usually developed by private companies, but at the same time, technical standards can be referenced in legally binding national regulations, and they can also account for technical barriers to trade under world trade law. So they do carry some legal force, and if you are able to shape technical standards, you by some means are also shaping actually the legal environment, the legal ecosystem internationally. The third dimension is a political one. If you have global standards, that sort of sounds ideal at first, but some states do have an active interest in having only standards of regional scope. Why is that the case? Because if a number of states are adopting a certain standard that is particular to one country, say a Chinese standard, then they need, in terms of maintenance of their equipment and in terms of further build out, for example, of an infrastructure, of a digital infrastructure, they need to rely on the suppliers that construct their technology based on that technical standard. And this is precisely why you can create actually lock-in effects by producing along those standards and internationalizing your own standards and not search for global standards. And finally, the discursive dimension, I think we see here is, and this also speaks to something Mr. Muniz has said, that technical standards shape the way we perceive technology, what we regard as normal technology, if you like. And that, I think, is an extremely important aspect. And that's my concluding point here in my opening intervention. What I think is what we have to recall is an example from quite some years ago, where for wireless local networks, we have established the Wi-Fi as the global standard. And a few years later, China for two times proposed an alternative, WAPI, that China claimed was more efficient, but that experts around the globe agreed cared less about privacy. This standard was rejected upon procedural accounts. But just imagine, what if China would have come first and proposed a WAPI standard, and we would not have developed the Wi-Fi as far as we were in the beginning? Then maybe WAPI would have become the global standard. And just now think of big data access that China has, AI applications where Chinese companies are relatively far ahead. And we run the risk of simply accepting and buying into Chinese standards here that come with ethical and political implications that we are simply not aware of, because we haven't thought outside the box yet. We have not developed those technologies to an extent that we can propose an alternative standard, and we don't even really think of those alternatives. So I think there's those four dimensions that actually could contribute to Chinese power, to European power as well, but I think that we need to be aware of, and that sort of gives us, I think, a good example of this shift in perception to geopolitics or geoeconomics of technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So as we have been talking about the European Union's role in data standardization, I would like to give the floor to Julien Nossetti, who is an associate fellow at the French Institute of International Affairs, where he is as a specialist of Russia's internet policies, as well internet foreign policy and governance. So I would like to talk a bit more about which are the main nodes of power apart from the ones in the United States and the European Union, especially the case of China and Russia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Raquel. I hope everyone hears me well and see me on screen. And actually, this global outlook on tech geopolitics is a fascinating exercise, because this is actually a sort of deep dive into today's backbone of world politics. And I promise, just during the few minutes we have on the floor, I won't talk about TikTok at all. My purpose rather is to stress the current US-China dynamics and competition in the tech realm. So, of course, many things could be said. I will focus on a few points I think are worth highlighting. And my first point is actually back to Barack Obama's first mandate as US president. Technology issues, be they digital, cyber, breakthrough technologies, and so on, they already featured prominently in the already strained US-China relations. Although at the time the focus was on the spot was clearly limited to the bilateral relationship, and I'm referring here to the long-time US accusations of Chinese state hacking and IP theft, of course. So and the innovation imperative would also justify the competition between Beijing and Washington better than classic rationales of military competition, and even than recurring commercial disputes between both countries. And I will get back later on, of course, to the Huawei affair. Just to give you one example of what I've just said, in the digital sphere, like in AI, for example, the sticking point, I think, is situated between the US will to maintain their technological supremacy, leadership, and China's ambition to challenge and to surpass by the next 2 decades that global US leadership. And this is key, of course, to comprehend for us Europeans. So I think to sum it up, in other words, one cannot understand the current tensions over 5G, for example, without assessing the mindset of both American and Chinese leaderships. On the American side, this means the fear of status loss, and on the Chinese side, it means an uninhibited power assertion through technology and through the internet. Of course, both arguments need to be qualified, but I won't have time here to nuance those arguments. So, what is interesting is that one of the reasons why the Huawei affair was so emotional in a way is that the US, I think, realized that it has gone wrong in at least one direction. And I would sum it up this way. I think the US understood that there's that it's difficult to fundamentally to tie innovation and democratization, as it used to be believed for quite a long time in the West and in the US most particularly. And one field which I think emphasizes quite clearly the split is AI. AI technologies like artificial vision or facial recognition, etc. They of course provide authoritarian regimes with unprecedented, tools and means to further consolidate the power. But nevertheless, things are far less simple than it's actually expressed, and many signs already show a sort of alignment between digital policies in Western countries and those of non-democratic regimes. And that is key. And I'm not saying here that the digital center of gravity has dramatically shifted to the East and to China, but rather that not so coherent policies in the US over the years have led to the situations we are now experiencing. And that situation is, in particular, that Europe is being tested in its immune defense system through the alleged greatest invention in the West for the past 50 years. That is the internet, and this is key, I think, to be stressed. A final point, because I think I could elaborate much more on that, is the outcome of the elections in the US, of course, because much will depend actually for Europeans in the tech digital field after the US elections, and it could have consequences for Europe. Will we see the continuation of undermining of multilateralism, the erosion of democratic values with the Trump elections? Probably. And here, this has clear implications in terms of internet freedom promotion, because as you all know, this was a key agenda motto for the US for many years. And here, I think Europe could try to take a sort of leadership, at least moral, in global internet freedom. Diplomacy, how is another question, but I think this could be a useful policy agenda that could be coupled with the strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty agenda. We could also expect, and I will finish here, with the US election, a pursuit of the exceptionalism policy, regardless of any diplomatic cost. And here, a couple of months ago, with the US Clean Network Program agenda, we have some preview, some teaser of what could happen, because in a way, the both China, of course, and the US both contribute to the fragmentation of the internet, of cyberspace at the world. And for Europeans, of course, who are still divided on that issue, this could trigger a welcome reaction and welcome policy agenda in that way. So thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So in the midst of this geopolitical competition, let's see that this is not only an issue about state to state or states to states. There are also multilateral organizations, and that's why we have today here with us Jason Muña, who is a special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General for the UN's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. So I think we all will be very interested in knowing which are the main developments that the United Nations has been doing over the time. And we will start with the questions at 55. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I appreciate it, and it's a very important discussion. You've already touched upon a number of different aspects. In Mr. Muñiz's comments, he mentioned a couple of things, such as the right to information and the economics of digital. And I think one aspect in which we've seen this is with this current COVID pandemic. In this pandemic, we've seen that even in the United States, my home country and where I work, and I imagine in Spain and elsewhere, we see this has exacerbated the digital divides. That not everybody has the ability to do their work online or to attend meetings like this online. And in education, this is a clear example where those that have access to the internet, those that have digital literacy and these skills are able to continue their studies or get online tutoring or online resources, whereas those that don't have internet access have been not able to participate. And the impact that this will have on them will last for several years as they fall further behind their classmates and peers. And this has impacts on their economic mobility and in the future. And we also see this in other aspects. We've seen in this pandemic, we've seen misinformation, disinformation. We've seen cyber attacks of hospitals, researchers trying to find cures or vaccines. And so this pandemic has really highlighted different issues, both at the national level and at the international level. And the real need for there to be cooperation on a range of things. So we've already talked about artificial intelligence. We talked about digital public goods. We talked about trust and security. And these are several aspects that we've been looking at the international level. And so recognizing the need for digital cooperation, the Secretary General of the United Nations convened a high-level panel for digital cooperation. And this brought together about 20 people from different stakeholder groups. So we had ministers, we had technology CEOs, we had other representatives. It was co-chaired by Bill and Melinda Gates. By Melinda Gates and Jack Ma from Alibaba. And together they put together a report with a series of recommendations. And then following this report, we had inputs from a range of stakeholders. And the Secretary General in June of this year published a roadmap for digital cooperation. And this roadmap covers 8 main areas: global connectivity, digital inclusion, human rights online, digital capacity building, digital public goods, artificial intelligence, digital trust and security, and global digital cooperation. And in this last area of global digital cooperation, this includes things such as the Global Internet Governance Forum and linkages with the national and regional Internet Governance Forum, such as the Spain IGF that we're taking part in right now. In addition to these 8 areas, this roadmap for digital cooperation also addressed the environment and child safety online as 2 examples of other areas where there is need for cooperation. And so we've already touched upon some of the tensions or some of the geopolitical aspects regarding some of these areas like artificial intelligence. And so that specific recommendation or area looks at things such as establishing a high-level advisory body with different stakeholders to look at the ethics of artificial intelligence and what are concerns that developing countries have and how we can make sure that artificial intelligence is geared for peace and for development. In the recommendation group on digital trust and security, they've also looked at how we can make sure that infrastructure for telecommunications is resilient, and how we can ensure that that we protect platforms online. And in each of these groups, we've benefited from the participation of a range of stakeholders, including Spanish companies and academics and others, and civil society. And so even though, as Mr. Muñoz mentioned, that if we look at the largest internet companies in the world, we may not see European companies among the largest. However, so there are some Spanish companies that have had an important role in providing connectivity in developing countries, especially Latin America and the Caribbean. Telefonica and Movistar have been very important in connectivity in the region and in developing countries. And so we encourage, this roadmap has been set forth, and over the next year, we will be putting together action plans along these different areas. And the IGF of Spain will be an important contribution in these efforts. And so I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion today.
Thank you, Jason. So it seems that people are really interested in this topic, and we have several questions. I will try to mix them up so that we can draw a broader picture of the issue. So there are several questions, and everyone can reply. So the first question comes from Carlos. He asks that with the rising importance of the internet in the international geopolitics, is net neutrality at risk, or is it currently not possible to control the internet? We have 2 minutes if someone wants to reply.
I guess while others are thinking, I'll just say very quickly, I know that countries have taken different approaches or views towards net neutrality. I understand in EU, there's a common position to favor net neutrality, whereas in some other countries, we have supported efforts to provide access to Facebook or other services so that people, or Wikipedia, for example, so that people can access information on a free basis without having to pay for the data to access that. So in EU, that would be considered not net neutrality, because you're favoring access to Wikipedia or Facebook, other things that people need to access communications. However, in some developing countries especially, this is important to provide access to connectivity and access to important information. So other countries and other regions have taken different approaches on this issue.
Great, thank you. So, Julian, do you want to?
Yeah, there was a question on the likely impact of the COVID-19 on the tech geopolitics. Actually, yeah, we could develop much more, but the COVID-19 especially highlighted pre-existing trends that global tech interdependence, which is still actual, but countered by both China and the US, of course, and it also especially highlighted the issue of diversifying supply chains, which several speakers have already mentioned. But if we have to keep in mind one aspect is this split in tech supply chains, which used to be totally globalized. I mean, industry, especially in chips, in AI chips as well, and this is I think the most important perhaps aspect of the past 6 months, this geoeconomic dimension to supply chains.
Thank you. So there are several questions on US bans on Chinese products, as well as the role that European companies such as Ericsson could have in this regard within the European Union. So which are some of your thoughts on the US ban on Chinese products? Do you think that this is a geopolitical strategy, or it rather respond to economic issues?
Can I chip in, Raquel? And I have to say that I have to be very punctual in my departure, so I'll have to leave right at the top of the hour. But on this topic of the China-US, we produced a number of foresight papers at the beginning of the pandemic, trying to understand what the impact of the pandemic would be on global issues. And one of the things that came up was that it carried the risk of deepening the rift between China and the United States, and adding a layer to the commercial, technological, security dimension of this, And that layer would be on the health governance piece and on the reputational piece. So there's been a huge back and forth between the two countries on responsibility for the crisis and others. So I think in this regard, and this is something Julian was saying before, I think it's a big accelerator of prior trends, including the worsening of the geopolitical landscape in East Asia, because of these things that I was just mentioning. On the tech products and others, even before we get into the discussion of tariffs, of sanctions, of this and that, of limiting market access to Chinese firms, I think we have a big conversation to have with them on level playing field, to be honest, because what we cannot have, and I think that this is simply not sustainable over time, is to have these highly integrated and competitive markets, particularly digital markets, which are, by the way, unless we do something about it, they tend to be oligopolistic, if not monopolistic, because of network effects and scale effects of these markets. We have a ton of data that point in this direction, and we simply cannot have this free access to our market and not have a level playing field. And have companies that have state funding, that have access to to soft loans and credits and others, and not have our own tech and innovation companies have access to these markets. So I think the framing from the European point of view is much more about level playing field than anything else, and then the rest of the considerations come in. But we should first deal with that issue.
Can I intervene?
Yes, we have. Yes, we have until 1.
No, about this, the general. If we had this discussion or this meeting next year, or on the 21st of January, with President Biden in the White House, I think the discussion would not be that different, because in the US, I think there is a bipartisan agreement on policy towards China, especially technological policy. It is Cold War 2.0 that I was saying. It's very bipartisan, and it deals with 3 major topics, I think. One is 5G, the other is semiconductors, and the other is web-based services. We've seen what happened with TikTok, and we're seeing now that Chinese Alibaba is buying Auchan, Alcampo in France, and that kind of thing, I think. And I also think that the new U.S. administration is going to put more pressure on Europe, and it will be more difficult to say no.
Let me finally, I know we're already over time, but let me give me 30 seconds to reply to the Ericsson questions and 5G, because I think there are several ones being directed at me. And I've been asked essentially here whether Ericsson will profit from it and whether that was Sweden's intention. I don't think so. Let me just remind you that Ericsson also is operating on the Chinese market. China has, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has yesterday been very clear in threatening Sweden of retaliation, economic retaliation, if this ban wasn't withdrawn. And you should know, I mean, yes, it's true that Ericsson has only a relatively limited market share in China, but the Chinese market is huge, and China is at this point quite ahead in the rollout of 5G than many parts of the world. So having only a small market share in China actually does mean quite a lot to a company like Ericsson at this point. And an even more important pressure point, and that's my last aspect here to say, is that Ericsson also in its supply very much relies on China. And here geopolitics and geoeconomics is back. I think that's the real pressure point that a company like Ericsson has to fear, that it is cut off, or that there's a delay of supply from China for its own products. Yes, Ericsson might actually grasp larger market shares in the West, in the US, in Europe, in other parts of the world, but it also comes with costs. So it's not just that Ericsson is the winner from this week's decision by Sweden. It is really multifaceted here.
Thank you. So our last question relates to the following one. Do you think that data processing issues will set countries apart or will bring them closer in political issues in the future. And I would like Jason to do, if possible, a focus on Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa in this data processing issue. Thank you.
No, I agree. Data processing is very important. I mean, it's what we do with the data and the skills and capacity to handle it. As far as bringing countries closer in political issues, I'm not really sure about that. I think each country has kind of approached them together, and that's an interesting thought. You know, could we see regional cooperation on data processing issues? You know, maybe. I think right now, though, just the big focus is really capacity building and skill development and literacy, providing, making sure that there's adequate electricity infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure. I mean, connectivity is a huge issue in much of Africa. And so we first need to get the telecommunications infrastructure and the electricity reliable provision of this infrastructure, and then look at the skills development and literacy, and then, you know, be able to see, you know, what regional cooperation we can have regarding data processing issues. At least that's just my initial perspective.
Thank you. So we are going to close this session, and I would like to do just a short reflection. We have seen through the discussion that actually there are still opportunities, limitations, and unsolved topics that we need to have in mind, because otherwise the growing geopolitics of technology and communications will not be well addressed. In this regard, I hope that through the discussion, everyone has learned more about this topic, and that this has opened up a new pathway to do more discussions. So thank you very much all, and I hope to see you again in person.